Alright, I want to make this short and sweet. This is my PvE bow build guide, and it's pretty straightforward. And after doing some testing, I tested both with the Hoplite bow, with another bow that had a more damage-focused perk, such as Attunement and Keenly Empowered. And last but not least, I tested Boltcaster, and I had the best results with the Boltcaster. But before we get into today's video, is sponsored by U7Buy, a trusted digital marketplace for all things gaming related. It's a one-stop shop for cheaper prices on gift cards, game keys, and other services at a 10% discount or more, serving millions of customers worldwide with over 30,000 reviews on Trustpilot, and you can even get a further 3% discount with code oreo at checkout. My referral link will be in the description. So without further ado, let's jump straight into the guide. I don't want to mess around, I want to make this one nice and quick compared to my other guides with brief explanations. So for my PvE bow guide, I went with the Boltcaster. As I said, I had the best results with this, comparing it to a damage or burst damage bow, and comparing it to the Hoplite bow with dots. The Boltcaster is simply too strong. Of course, now there's no downsides in PvE after they removed Banes and all that a long time ago. And not only that, you have some really nice built-in perks on the Boltcaster. So we can probably jump onto explaining that. So Boltcaster, of course, converts 99% of our damage to a lightning, which is very strong. But the second part of that perk, on Electrified, we get 20% more basic attack damage on our arrows, right? Which is extremely strong and is a massive boost when we are specifically using light attacks on the Boltcaster, because this is what makes it so strong. Is we don't do heavy attacks in PvE, which I do quickly want to mention, and you'll see that in the Worm speedrun later on. You do not use heavy attacks. It is a waste of time charging up shots constantly, and you get far better DPS spamming rapid shot on cooldown and alternating into light attacks. Next to that, you have Bolt, which also works fantastic in PvE. You know, after 3 consecutive hits, you'll get a shock of lightning, which deals 80% damage. Fantastic, more DPS. Shocking lightning, this one is less likely to be procced, but in the case it does get procced, that is just more bonus damage. On top of that, we have Enchanted built into it. That's another 5% damage, fantastic. And last but not least is the perk we added to it. So I added Keenly Empowered, and if you're wondering why I added Keenly Empowered, it is because, number one, we don't want Keenly Jagged, because Keenly Jagged is a bleed stack that only one person can benefit from in PvE, especially on a boss like the Worm or Typhoon or any of those raid bosses. So that is why I went with Keenly Empowered, which makes up for power that we're not going to proc with bow in PvE. And what I mean by that is, there are certain empower talents and perks that we will not proc consistently in PvE, which is why, in my opinion, I had the best results using Keenly Empowered. Of course, we can't add attunements because we have Shirking, and of course we can't add Disdained Infliction because we have Enchanted, same perk pool. So that is the explanation behind Boltcaster, and you'll see the damage later in the video. Auto attacks, generally speaking, we're doing around 9 to 10k for me. On Scorpions, we're even hitting up to 12k on light attacks. You can actually get light attacks to do more than in the bow gameplay at the end of the video, because I didn't have a lightning damage ring. So I was missing out on a further 7% in power. So without further ado, we can jump onto the Rapier. The Rapier you can be using a lot. Of course, you're not going to be using it in the Worm, because that is, you know, you're a pad player. But in things like the Hive of Gorgons, you could be using Rapier a lot more. And to that, what is the best Rapier option? Lifering. Lifering is an amazing Rapier for burst damage, and you're probably thinking, what about the Hoplite Rapier? The Hoplite Rapier is fantastic for damage over time builds. The Boltcaster PvE bow build is all about burst. We don't have many dots, so what's the point of Disdained Infliction? So we go with the Lifering. The Lifering, we're going to chuck Diamond in, generally speaking. If you know the mechanics in PvE, you should not be taking damage. You should always be at full HP. So we're going to chuck Vicious or Rogue for backstab damage. As mentioned, we shouldn't be taking damage. We should be on the opposing side of our tank, behind the boss, going for that backstab damage. And last but not least, since this doesn't have a weapon perk on it like Finisher, we can add Omnidirectional Evade. And when we're evade spamming, which is the tree we use for this build, which we will refer to later, we get a shitload of bonus burst damage, which is fantastic. Next bit or last but not least, sorry, not last but not least, but now moving on to the armor, you've got my explanation on the rapier. We're going to be running the Gorgon crafted light headwear, and we will, of course, cover the Aeternum leather pants later, as that is still the dominant PvE and PvP dex artifact. But for the head, we're going to be chucking on lightning harnessing, enchant board, and penetrating rapid shot. Penetrating rapid shot, fantastic, more bonus damage. This won't work on some enemies as it's actually armor penetration, but there are a lot of enemies that have armor pen, and it's just going to be in general a nice perk to have. But there's something a little bit more interesting that we are going to be running on our PvE bow build, and that is Electrified Calm. You're probably wondering, what does a Calm gem do? A Calm gem gives us more damage when an enemy is taunted. Now that enemy doesn't have to be taunted by us, that's not the point of it, we're not a tank. But if we have a traditional tank in our raid composition, which you will do when you're doing the Hive of Gorgons raid, is you get to do 1.5% further increased damage, and that's not in power, that's the best bit, that's just bonus damage that we get to do. So we run all of these gems on our armor and our jewelry and do a shitload more damage. I think it's like 8% or might be 9% or 10% more damage to enemy or to a raid boss in a traditional raid composition, especially present in the Hive of Gorgons raid or mutations. The note to take away from this is that you will take a lot more damage, and comes into the, once again, the fact that if you are not an experienced player and you don't understand the mechanics very well and you are learning, I recommend going with Electrified Onyx and just having that general physical damage absorption and resistances to your slash, thrust, and strike. But again, if you are more experienced, I would definitely recommend the Calm, as of course in PvE you're trying to min-max your damage. And, you know, if you really want to, you definitely want to go with Calm. And again, if you're experienced. Of course, Lightning Harnessing, that's always active in power, which is absolutely what you want. No matter what, we're always going to have that increased damage. Of course, running the electrified cases as well. So every single piece of our armor is giving us a further 4% in power. On top of that 1.5%, we're getting 5.5% bonus damage per piece of armor, which is insane. Jumping onto the chest, we're running the Silken Cocoon, and this comes from the Sandworm raid, and you get Shirking Energy, Keen, and Lightning Harnessing. Of course, we bring Lightning Harnessing on, or add Lightning Harnessing onto this one, alongside that Electrified Calm. Shirking Energy, not going to be used too much, but Keen is fantastic, as some bosses do not have a headshot for guaranteed crits. This is especially true with the Sandworm Sharnetian, doesn't have a headshot. So Keen, having that crit chance to get more crits, is essential and fantastic to have. Jumping on to the gloves here, we're again running Lightning Harnessing and then Refreshing. Now, you could say, hey, enchantable, but in my opinion, Refreshing is great on the bow build. Now, I didn't mention Refreshing in the PvE Musket guide, and that is purely because you don't need Refreshing on Musket because its cooldowns are so short. However, with bow cooldowns are much longer, upwards of even 30 seconds in some cases, where Refreshing actually becomes very relevant and quite good for min-maxing our DPS in the long run, right? You know, shorter cooldowns, more DPS, faster, you know, cooldowns, you get more abilities in the rotation, right? Of course, in our third perk there, Leeching Flurry, this is a fantastic perk, especially if you get close with the Rapier and Hive of Gorgons. Getting that immunity, getting that leech, you're basically going to be invincible if you have good positioning and don't stand in front of your tank. Once again, adding Electrified Calm on there, getting our most out, or getting the most out of our damage, which is really nice. Of course, jumping onto our armor artifact, Aeternum leather pants, pretty stock standard here. Pretty much every build I make has these. Chucking on Lightning Harnessing, of course, and Electrified Calm, self-explanatory to min-max our stats, especially in PvE. You do not want wing leather shoes at all in PvE, because you're not going to be proccing haste all the time. You actually have very bad DPS if you are rolling all the time. We want to avoid that. You know, you want to roll sometimes to proc your evasive tactics, and that's about it. Jumping onto our shoes, we have Enchantable and Lightning Harnessing. Now, if you've noticed, we've only had 2 Refreshing on our armor. We'll jump onto that in a sec, but in short, we use the last 2 Refreshing on our jewelry, as jewelry perks are a lot less needed in this build. So, last but not least, we have our lightning harnessing and our enfeebling poison shot on the shoes here. Enfeebling poison shot isn't a must. You could honestly swap that for a refreshing if you wanted, or you could swap that for anything else. You could literally do anything. I put enfeebling poison shot as you may get some use out of it, providing a tiny bit of weaken for your team so they take less damage. Doesn't really matter. Just lightning harnessing obviously being the key there with the electrified calm, min-maxing our damage. Jumping onto the amulet, this is where things get a little bit more complex. Of course, chucking in calming for our min-maxing our damage. If you're less experienced, chuck in the elemental or damage type resistance of the content you're doing. So if you're doing an ice mutation or it's ice week, you want to put aquamarines in your amulet. If you're doing Hive of Gorgons, Typhoon, you want to chuck, I think, Strike in your amulet, right? If you're doing the Worm, you want to chuck Strike in, or Opal if you're on pads, actually, because that's acid resistance. But the key thing to take away here is our protection. I'm showing Strike protection on this one, but the ultimate in-game goal of PvE is to get an amulet with a protection of every single kind. You want an amulet with strike protection, amulet with ice protection, flame protection, nature protection, void protection, thrust protection, and slash protection. That is your in-game goal in PvE, so you can interchange the amulet depending on the content you do, and is the best min-max way to resist damage and be able to run calming gems. This is, at least in my opinion, the most essential part to allow you to at least not get completely one-shot if you make a mistake, and is, in my opinion, the thing you want to focus on most importantly in a PvE set, alongside, of course, your harnessings and your rune glasses. But next to that, you obviously want to prioritize the amulets you're going to use the most, so you probably want to pick up your strike amulet first, because that's going to be useful for the first 2 bosses in Hive of Gorgons, and that's going to be useful in the Worm raid, if you're playing Rapier especially. Then you'd probably want to focus maybe a flame protection or a void. Any of those in any order doesn't really matter because the mutations are random. But, you know, if there's a certain mutation that you only do compared to other weeks, so for example, if you only like doing ice, then you probably want to get an ice amulet next. And just work down the chain, pick up an amulet for every single protection. You don't really need a thrust protection amulet. You probably could have left that one out, but definitely get one for all of the elements plus strike. We're adding empowered onto this, so our timed empowers last longer, and in some cases makes our timed empowers last permanently, especially empowers on our musket tree, on our bow tree, such as evasive tactics. We're adding health onto that, doesn't really matter, but bonus health is great, but it's not needed, but there's really no other perks we need to pick up on the amulet. Gorgonite Ring, we're using Hardy and Lightning damage. Hardy, in my opinion, is a must in every single aspect of the game, so you can double light roll. Next to that, obviously Lightning damage. This is just, again, more general, and Power that has 24/7 uptime, adding Calming to that as well for more damage. Again, if you're less experienced, adding in the gem content, also adding in the gem relevant to the content you're doing, so you have a little bit more protection. And then the third perk there is Refreshing, as honestly I could not figure out another relevant perk you need. You don't need poisoning, you don't need disease, you don't need bloodletting, you have no bleeds, you don't need burning, you don't have no burns, other than, I guess, explosive arrow, which we will jump onto here, but in my opinion, Refreshing is what you want. That's the most optimal way to go about it, in my opinion, so that's what I went with. Then we have the Endless Thirst with Empowering Toast, Fortifying Toast. Again, you can backbar mana pots to have a 24/7 uptime and power. Alongside Empowered on your amulet, I think it comes out to like 8 or 9 seconds in power. Oh, sorry, it comes out to 10 seconds. Yeah, I think it's perma. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it becomes a perma uptime and power on Empowering Toast, as long as you backbar the mana pots and get that down in your muscle memory. Again, adding Calming onto that, and for the perk we added to it, I added Refreshing, which is our 4 out of 4. That's our 4 Refreshing right there. Again, some people add Nimble or whatever. I went with Refreshing, as that is actually quite good for bow in PvE. As I said, bow has pretty long cooldowns. Jumping onto the Heartrune. Now, we went with the Cunning Heartrune of Cannon Blast. Why we went with Cunning over something like the Brutal Heartrune of Cannon Blast is this is to min-max our damage. The Cunning Heartrune of Cannon Blast narrows down the projectile size to be very small, but massively increases your Heartrune damage. And this is important for this perk down here, Burning Blast, which adds a burn to the target we're shooting. So if we're shooting a raid boss, we get a burn on that boss. And this can get pretty high. If you look at the PvE raid speedrun at the end, it gets up to around about, I think 1200 I saw it get to at one point, which is a damage over time that's just going to be taken away. So that is a fantastic reason to go with Cunning as compared to Brutal. I did try the Heartrune, or Brutal Heartrune of Cannon Blast, and I got a much smaller burn tick. I think it was only like 700 or 600. The Cunning brought that up massively and is why I recommend it. Now onto the bow trees, or the trees, sorry. We are running the Triple Rapids Explosive and Poison. Poison for the damage over time effect, and allowing us to apply a debuff so we get more damage while hitting a debuff target. Obviously picking up the perk that makes the debuffs said last longer as well. Penetrating Rapid Shots, of course we're going to pick this up, and all 3 nodes to it, or 2 nodes to it. You know, you get the cooldown back pretty much instantly having the second node. Third node adds bonus damage to the third arrow in the Rapids. Now we did have to pick up a lot of the passives like the slows and such on the skirmisher side, purely to get evasive tactics, which is of course more important than the right side passive alt, as the right side passive alt is bonus headshot damage, which, as you might have guessed, is kind of pointless when, you know, some bosses don't even have a headshot spot, such as Sharnish and Advaro. So anyways, again, we went with that evasive tactics, which is just empower on dodge, which you will probably be proccing pretty consistently. Of course, again, third perk here, we went with explosive arrow to get the burn, which is again going to give us another damage over time effect. Ultimately, there is an option here where you could drop explosive arrow for rain of arrows and have a bleed tick instead. That is up to you and what you feel more comfortable with. I prefer the burst of explosive arrow over the damage over time bleed from rain of arrows, as rain of arrows initial damage isn't that strong in PvE unless you're using it for clearing trash mobs. And in my opinion, I like using explosive arrow more. Obviously, pin shot is kind of useless, and evade shot shouldn't be used at all in PvE. It's completely useless. Onto the rapier tree, which is running the evade spam tree with repost, flurry, and fletch. Oh, sorry, repost, flurry, and evade. If this is basically perma safety tree in my opinion. You basically never have to worry about dying if you play this right, especially with leeching flurry. You alternate between evade spamming if you want to, you know, safeguard from an attack, you use your post, and if you're about to take damage, just hit flurry and you're good to go. You can probably, in my opinion, you can never die with this build if you have a competent raid composition. And again, is in my opinion my favorite rapier tree because it's so easy to use. Again, we don't use bleed tree here. That's what your bleed rapier players will be doing. They usually play with finisher and IG or VG offhand. We play bow rapier, bow being our main hand, rapier being our offhand. And last but not least, jumping onto the stats. The stats, I have tested everything. I tested all different stat splits, and this is what I got the best damage with. Of course, going full glass cannon, if you know what you're doing, you do not need to run any con, you max out your DPS. However, I do quickly want to add, if you are new and you don't know the mechanics and you're learning to build, jump a little or add a little bit of constitution in there. It could be 50, it could be 100, you can just take it away from dex, that is fine. But if you're experienced with the build and not getting hit by mechanics, bump up that dex, max it out. We obviously pick up 150 int for both the 100 and 150 int passive nodes, which greatly benefit the Boltcaster, and same with the 25 strength there. Since we have Aeternum Leather Pants, we might as well pick it up. This is again what I got the best damage stats or damage results with, and what I would recommend running. That is pretty much everything for the entire build, except I haven't quite yet covered the pre-best in slot. And for pre-best in slot, of course, I've got to recommend it once again, is the Azoth Crystal set, which is actually fantastic for Boltcaster, as it comes with Enchanted Ward and also comes with Refreshing, and you can add Lightning Harnessing to that. And next to that, you can use for jewelry the Tanglevine Amulet, or any other amulet. It doesn't really matter, as long as it is, you know, got a protection on it. and you should be sweet. For the ring, you could use probably, I think it's the Soul Pollen. I can't quite remember the name. Let me quickly find it here. Yep, you could use the Soul Pollen as your ring, which, actually no, because that's thrust damage. You could probably go the Red Hot Slag, and then you could add lightning damage to that. Of course, it's got bloodletting. Ultimately, you'd want refreshing, but at the end of the day, you want a 2-cracker ring, right? So you have hardy, just slap on lightning damage, and you're good to go. And then last but not least, for airing, obviously you want the Endless Thirst, which you should all be able to get. And then Boltcaster is also very easy to get, so there should be no exceptions. You don't really need a pre-best in slot bow, when your best bow is your pre-best in slot bow. And then obviously Lifering Rapier is very easy to farm out, as that is a solo farm, I believe, in Eden Grove. So that's pretty much everything for the entire PvE bow build guide, and I hope you enjoyed, and without further ado, we'll jump into the Sandworm speedruns.